The moment the broadcast lights flared to life, the tension in the room turned electric. On one side of the stage stood Karoline Leavitt, confident, poised, and backed by a conservative media machine eager for a new firebrand. On the other side, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, a man whose military fatigues looked strikingly out of place in the polished studio, yet whose calm demeanor made even the seasoned moderators tread carefully. The debate had been billed as a discussion on international cooperation, sovereignty, and aid. But by the 10-minute mark, it was anything but. Karoline had come prepared to land blows. She criticized Africa's dependency mindset, mocked international aid requests, and then delivered the line that would light up headlines. "You know what, Mr. Traoré?" she sneered, adjusting her mic and leaning forward. "If you don't like how we run things, maybe you should just go back to your desert." Gasps. Not from the audience, which had been carefully selected to favor her, many of whom laughed and clapped, but from the American public watching live. The comment, sharp and laced with condescension, ricocheted across social media within seconds. All eyes turned to Traoré. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his posture, clasped his hands behind his back, and smiled slightly, as if Karoline had just handed him a gift. Then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. "You call it a desert," Traoré said, voice calm like a gathering storm. "But to me, it's a land where people grow food with cracked hands, where children smile despite dust, and where dignity isn't bought or borrowed." The studio fell into an eerie silence. Even the moderator, who had been ready to pivot away, let the moment hang. Karoline blinked, once, twice. She had expected outrage. Instead, she got composure and poetry. Traoré took a step forward. "You speak of deserts, but what I see in your country, Ms. Levitt, is a different kind of emptiness, a spiritual one, a nation so loud it can no longer hear truth when it's whispered." That was when the audience stopped laughing. What had started as a typical political brawl had just shifted into something far more dangerous. For Karoline. Because now, she wasn't dealing with a man trying to defend his homeland. She was facing a leader who didn't need to shout to be heard, and America was listening. Karoline Leavitt didn't rise from nothing to become a national political figure by backing down. And yet, in that studio, with cameras still rolling and Traoré's quiet defiance reverberating in the air, something cracked beneath her polished surface. She forced a smirk, but it didn't land like her campaign videos. "That was poetic," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "But I deal in reality, not fairy tales." Traoré didn't blink. "Reality is what people live, not what politicians narrate." A flicker crossed Karoline's face. The kind of flicker that only shows up when someone realizes the script in their head is slipping. "This isn't Burkina Faso," she snapped. "We don't get lectured by unelected military men who parade around in camouflage like it gives them authority." Traoré turned toward her slowly, almost with pity. "If I wore a suit," he said, "would you hear me more clearly? Or is it the color of my skin? The continent I come from?" He wasn't yelling, he wasn't angry. That was what made it worse. He was composed, dignified, and somehow, with just a few words, he had made her look smaller, not in stature, but in moral weight. Karoline tried to fire back. "You don't intimidate me." But the room heard what she hadn't meant to show. Her voice wavered just slightly. Traoré smiled faintly. "I'm not here to intimidate," he said. "That's your language, not mine." A low murmur spread across the crowd. Even among those who had come to cheer for Levit, something about the energy had shifted. No one had expected this African leader, unknown to many before tonight, to dominate the stage without even raising his tone. Back in Washington, aides watching the live feed scrambled. Political consultants whispered to each other, "This clip will go viral by morning." One leaned in and said, "She just gave him a platform, and he's using it better than any senator could." Karoline sensed it too. Her eyes darted to the camera, then back to Traore. He was standing with his hands clasped, as if ready for nothing more than truth to carry his message. "You came here to humiliate me," he said, now addressing the camera directly. "But I didn't come to defend myself. I came to remind your country what it used to stand for." There was no applause, only silence. And that silence was louder than any slogan Karoline had ever tweeted. By the time the debate ended, the moment had already taken on a life of its own. The now viral clip, Karoline Leavitt sneering, "Go back to your desert," followed by Traore's calm, devastating reply, was everywhere. On TikTok, it was remixed over moody music. On Instagram, political pages framed it as the slap that didn't need a hand. On Twitter, the hashtags number Traore truth and number desert reply were trending globally. But it wasn't just social media. Major news outlets, both left and right, ran with the story, some condemning Karoline's comment, others marveling at how Traore had turned the insult into a moment of global reflection. Inside Fox News headquarters, senior producers debated cutting Karoline's follow-up interviews. "She looks unprepared," one muttered. "He cornered her with kindness," another said. At CNN, a commentator exclaimed on live television, "That wasn't a response. That was a masterclass in restraint and dignity." Back at Traore's hotel, his team watched the chaos unfold without celebration. The president himself remained quiet, sipping dark coffee as journalists blew up his phone. A young aide turned to him. "Mr. President, you didn't just survive the attack. You reversed it. Everyone's quoting you." Traore looked out the window, where protesters had gathered, some in support, some furious. "I didn't come to be quoted," he said. "I came to challenge the myth." The aide furrowed his brow. "What myth?" "That America listens only to power spoken in its own tongue," Traore replied. "Last night I whispered something different, and they heard it." Meanwhile, Karoline was in damage control mode. Her team huddled behind closed doors in a D.C. office suite, trying to reframe the narrative. "We say he ambushed her, that it was a setup," one strategist offered. "No!" Karoline cut in sharply. "That man made me look like a caricature." For the first time in her political career, Karoline Leavitt realized she hadn't just lost a debate, she had lost control of the narrative, and it had been taken from her not with shouting, not with anger, but with silence and strength. The fallout from the debate wasn't just digital, it was diplomatic. Less than 48 hours after the exchange, the White House reached out, not to Karoline, to Traore. Officially, the call was framed as a gesture of goodwill between partners. But everyone knew what it was: damage control. The president's foreign policy team had watched the debate with mounting discomfort, realizing that a freshman American politician had insulted a sitting African head of state, live and on U.S. soil. The president didn't want a scandal, he wanted a meeting. Traore declined at first. It wasn't pride, it was principle. "I didn't come to beg," he told his advisors, "and I don't answer to a headline." But when his aide read aloud a handwritten message from a U.S. diplomat, one that acknowledged Karoline's remark as deeply regrettable, Traore reconsidered. He agreed to meet the president, but under one condition: "The cameras must stay on. I won't be reshaped behind closed doors." Meanwhile, Karoline was facing a storm of her own. Her base had split in two. Some praised her bluntness. Others said she'd handed her opponent the moral high ground. Talk show hosts debated whether she should apologize. Donors hesitated. "I don't apologize to tyrants," she declared to her staff. "But he never raised his voice," one staffer mumbled. That silence echoed through her war room. Worse still, polling began to shift. Not dramatically, but enough. Young voters who had never heard of Traore before the debate now saw him as something else, not a threat, but a voice of unexpected dignity. Then came the headline that shook her team: "From dust to dignity, the African president who outsmarted Washington's sharpest tongue." And beneath it, a still image: Karoline mid-sneer, and Traore standing still, arms behind his back, looking at her like a professor waiting for a student to realize their mistake. In a moment of rare honesty, Karoline stared at the photo in silence. "He didn't humiliate me," she whispered to herself. Then, after a long pause, "He revealed me." 3 days after the debate, Washington prepared for an event it hadn't anticipated. Ibrahim Traoré, the defiant voice from the so-called desert, was arriving at the White House. There were no red carpets, no press conferences, just a closed-door meeting, televised only because Traoré insisted it be. When he stepped through the South Portico wearing the same olive uniform, unshaken and unpolished, the American press corps looked stunned. Here was a man who had made global headlines without shouting, without posturing, just presence. President Biden greeted him with the usual courtesies, but Traoré didn't waste time. "I'm not here for photos," he said plainly. "I'm here for clarity." The room tensed. The president nodded. "Then let's speak plainly." Cameras rolled. Traoré didn't make demands. He made observations about U.S. policy in Africa, about partnerships that smelled more like instructions, and about how dignity was always the first casualty in global aid. "Your aid often comes with a leash," he said, "and we're tired of being the dog." The president winced, but didn't interrupt. Traoré continued, "You want to help? Respect us enough to let us define what help looks like." Across the nation, Americans tuned in out of curiosity, but many stayed for something else. The rare sight of someone talking to power instead of at it. Not to grovel, not to provoke, but to insist. Back in her office, Karoline Leavitt watched from a distance, flanked by silence. "He's stealing my airtime," she muttered, but even she knew. He wasn't stealing anything. He had earned the spotlight. At the end of the broadcast, a young reporter asked Traoré, "Do you feel vindicated after the debate?" He turned, calm as ever. "I feel responsible," he said, "because silence is not surrender. And when someone tells you to go back to your desert, sometimes you need to remind them. The desert grows people who never bowed." That quote would echo across headlines for a week, but for Karoline Leavitt, it was worse than a quote. It was a legacy, because she had fired the first shot. And Traoré, without ever aiming, had won the war of words. A week later, the headlines had begun to shift. What had started as a debate gone wrong had transformed into something more profound, a national reckoning. Op-eds began surfacing in major publications, not about Traoré's military past or Karoline's political ambitions, but about something deeper, about dignity, about language, about the quiet power of restraint. One piece in The Atlantic read, "America heard a whisper, and it roared louder than our own voices." On college campuses, students organized panels discussing modern diplomacy and post-colonial respect. At Howard University, a packed auditorium hosted a screening of the debate, followed by a standing ovation for Traoré. Even conservative commentators had to admit it. The African president had become a symbol, unintentionally perhaps, but undeniably. Back in New Hampshire, Karoline sat with her team. Aides nervously scrolled polling data. Suburban independents were slipping. African-American approval had cratered, and worse still, her online engagement was no longer surging. It was collapsing under the weight of a single question, repeated over and over. "Why did you say it like that?" She knew what they meant. It wasn't the words, "Go back to your desert." It was the tone, the sneer, the dismissiveness. It wasn't just a political error. It had exposed something in her, and now it wouldn't go back into the box. Meanwhile, Traoré returned to Ouagadougou quietly. No parade, no speeches, just business. His people greeted him not with cheers, but with nods. The kind that said, "We saw you." At a small press conference back home, a Burkinabe journalist asked him, "Do you think you changed America's mind?" Traoré smiled gently. "I didn't go to change minds. I went to remind them we have one." The journalist laughed. But Traore didn't. That matters, he added, because for too long they've spoken as if we are subjects. I wanted them to see we are sovereigns, too. In America, that message had landed. Not everywhere, not instantly, but enough. Enough to make a young politician think twice before sneering again. Pressure mounted on Karoline Leavitt, from donors, from senior Republican advisors, from even her inner circle. You need to walk it back, one consultant insisted. Not because you were wrong, because you lost control of the narrative. That's what matters. She paced the room, jaw tight. If I apologize, she said slowly, I'm admitting he won. A silence settled. You're not admitting he won, another aide replied carefully. You're reclaiming the stage. But Karoline didn't want to reclaim it through retreat. Her political persona had always thrived on strength, on never backing down. And yet, something about this moment didn't fit that playbook. Because Traore hadn't beaten her with aggression, he had beaten her with grace. And that stung more. Eventually, she took to a microphone. But it wasn't an apology. It was a speech titled, Why I Stand My Ground. She framed herself as a victim of political correctness, as a fighter for unapologetic American values. She didn't mention Traore by name, but everyone knew. What she didn't expect was the reaction. The base didn't roar. They sighed. Commentators called the speech tone-deaf. The headlines wrote themselves. When silence was powerful, she chose noise. Karoline doubles down and falls flat. That night, on a popular late-night show, a comedian joked, she told a guy to go back to the desert and then got lost in one of her own. But while Karoline clung to sound bites, Traore vanished from the media cycle, deliberately. His team received dozens of interview requests. CNN, the BBC, even 60 Minutes. He declined them all. He's playing chess, one journalist whispered. She's still stuck in checkers. The silence became his message. It made his words from the debate echo longer, stronger. As Karoline kept speaking, she reminded people of her mistake. As Traore stayed silent, he reminded them of his strength. It became the contrast no campaign could spin. She yelled. He waited, and America remembered the one who didn't flinch. The following month, Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage at a major conservative summit in Texas. It was supposed to be a rallying moment, her political comeback. The crowd was packed, the cameras were ready, and the applause as she walked out was loud enough to shake the walls. But it didn't last. Midway through her speech, she brought it up, not by name, but with a jab. We won't apologize to men who wear medals and expect us to kneel because they've seen sand. The room stiffened. She smiled like it was a victory line. It wasn't. A young woman in the crowd stood up and shouted, "Then why did you look so small when he didn't even raise his voice?" Scattered claps. Not a roar, but not silence either. Karoline's face hardened. "Security," she said into the mic. But it was too late. The moment had pierced through the show. Later that day, a clip of the incident went viral under the caption, Traore spoke once. She's still defending herself. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in a dusty schoolyard in Burkina Faso, young students gathered around a cracked television screen as their teacher replayed the debate again. Some didn't fully understand the words, but they felt the weight. "Why didn't he yell?" a boy asked. The teacher smiled. "Because strength doesn't always come with volume." That message spread in quiet waves. In Europe, progressive leaders referenced Traore's remarks in parliamentary debates. In South America, activists adopted the phrase, "The desert grows people who never bowed," as a rallying cry. And in African capitals, murals appeared. Portraits of Traore standing still as the storm raged around him. He had become more than a president. He had become a symbol. And Karoline, the once rising star, was now locked in a fight she couldn't win, not because she lost a debate, but because she never learned how to lose with grace. Months passed. The headlines faded. New controversies took their place in the American political cycle. But one name remained quietly present: Traore. He didn't chase the spotlight, but it never left him. At a United Nations summit in Geneva, he gave a short speech. Just 5 minutes, no theatrics, no podium pounding. He didn't even mention Karoline Leavitt. But he didn't need to. In our languages, he said softly, we have no word for humiliation, only for forgetting who you are. Some in the audience leaned forward, recognizing the subtext. Others simply stared, captivated by the weight in his tone. Afterward, reporters tried to corner him. President Traoré, do you feel vindicated? President Traoré, what would you say to Karoline Leavitt now? He stopped only once, turning to the press line. I would say nothing, he replied. Some echoes are meant to fade. Back in the U.S., Karoline's political team was collapsing under infighting. Her campaign manager quit. Her polling numbers in swing states dropped to record lows. Even conservative talk radio hosts began calling her a missed opportunity. But what truly broke her wasn't the media, it was a single letter. It came from a high school in Harlem, handwritten by a group of black students who had watched the debate in a civics class. It read, "Thank you for reminding the world that calm can be power, that men who come from deserts can carry oceans of dignity, and that sometimes being still is louder than yelling. We saw you. We felt you. We won't forget." The letter ended with no signatures, just a line. You made us proud even if it wasn't your country. Karoline read it in silence, and for the first time she didn't roll her eyes. She didn't defend herself. She didn't summon her team. She folded the letter and slipped it into a drawer she never opened again, because somewhere deep down she knew. The desert didn't need to speak again. It had already said enough. Ibrahim Traoré never released a memoir. He didn't sell his silence, didn't cash in on the moment, didn't tour TV studios with rehearsed lines. But his words from that night, calm, cutting, unshakable, became legend. At West Point, a professor quoted him in a lecture on leadership. Silence is not surrender. At Oxford, his debate was dissected alongside Mandela and King. At small universities in forgotten parts of the world, students shared clips of him, not because he was flashy, but because he proved something no algorithm could predict. Dignity is disruptive. Karoline Leavitt, once hailed as the rising face of a new conservative movement, faded into a strange political limbo. She kept her seat. Barely, but her voice had lost something vital, credibility. People didn't boo her. They stopped listening. A former staffer put it best in an anonymous op-ed. She mistook volume for vision. He understood that restraint was resistance. Years later, when Traoré was honored at a multilateral summit in Nairobi, journalists again tried to drag the debate back into the conversation. One asked, "Do you think America has changed since that night?" Traoré paused, as always. "I think," he said slowly, "America was reminded that the world has eyes, and that sometimes the people you try to silence teach you what listening really means." No applause, just understanding. And in the audience, a new generation of diplomats, white, black, Arab, Asian, nodded. Because they had grown up watching that clip, not just for the burn, not just for the twist, but for the man who stood still and still shook the room. That's how history works sometimes, not with fireworks, but with someone who answers a sneer, with silence, truth, and something the world wasn't ready for, grace. Sometimes it only takes one moment, one sentence, to reveal the difference between arrogance and strength. Karoline Leavitt raised her voice, believing the louder she spoke, the more America would stand behind her. But Ibrahim Traoré never needed to shout. He stood in silence, spoke with clarity, and reminded the world that true power doesn't come from volume, it comes from conviction. He didn't just defend his homeland, he reminded a superpower that dignity is borderless. And in doing so, he didn't just win a debate, he made history.